Hi, I'm Richard Wolff, an economist, professor, and someone who has dedicated his life to understanding the patterns that guide the rise and fall of great economic and political powers. For decades, I have analyzed the historical cycles of empires, their periods of splendor, their excessive expansion, and, eventually, their inevitable decline. Today, with some concern but also with a deep sense of responsibility, I feel I must share with you something that perhaps many do not want to hear, but that I consider absolutely necessary to face. The collapse of the American empire could be much closer than we imagine. The signs of the decline of the American empire are not new. They have been before our eyes, slowly accumulating, while we have grown accustomed to ignoring them or explaining them away as temporary problems. But as an economist committed to truth, I feel a duty to speak frankly, even if it is uncomfortable. I say this not just as an observer, but as someone who lives inside this system and senses its tensions firsthand. History shows that no empire is eternal. Rome, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, they all faced critical moments when their internal tensions and external pressures led them to decline. The United States is no exception. Today we must recognize these warning signs, explore the factors that undermine the system, and learn from the past. Only then can we collectively face this challenge and prepare to build a different and more resilient future. Consider an example that is rarely associated with the decline of an empire: the housing crisis. Today, millions of people in the United States face a bleak landscape in which affordable housing has become a privilege rather than a basic right. Houses and apartments once affordable to working families have been snapped up by a market that prioritizes luxury and corporate profits. What do we see? Entire neighborhoods transformed by gentrification. Communities that used to be home to middle-class families are now littered with high-rises filled with mostly empty luxury apartments, bought only as investments. Meanwhile, people who can't afford the new prices are displaced. Some end up in the suburbs, far from their jobs, schools, and social circles. Others fall into destitution altogether. This phenomenon is not accidental. It is a direct reflection of a system that, in its decay, prioritizes the accumulation of capital in the hands of a few over the well-being of the majority. Investments are directed toward developments that generate quick returns for the elites, not toward the creation of affordable housing or social programs that stabilize communities. And why is this happening? Because the system no longer generates the collective wealth it used to. Instead of redistributing resources to ensure stability and progress for all, wealth is concentrated, leaving the rest to deal with an increasingly hostile and unequal landscape. This is one of the clearest signs of a collapsing empire. Let us now talk about the war in Ukraine, a conflict that has exposed the cracks in the global power structure and, above all, in American influence. From the beginning, the United States and its European allies thought this would be an easy fight to win. Economic sanctions against Russia, combined with a decision to cut off dependence on Russian oil and gas, seemed like a foolproof strategy. They believed that Russia would be economically strangled, that its economy would collapse within months, and that this would force Moscow to surrender or back down. However, the reality was very different. Russia not only withstood the onslaught, but reoriented its economy eastward with a speed that few anticipated. Rather than relying on European markets, it established stronger trade relations with giants such as China and India. Both countries, far from isolating Russia, seized the opportunity to fill trade gaps. China, for example, significantly increased its purchases of Russian oil and gas, securing energy supplies at lower prices. At the same time, India positioned itself as one of the main buyers of Russian fuels, despite pressure from the West. The impact was so great that, as an indirect consequence, China established itself as the world's largest exporter of automobiles, surpassing traditional powers such as Japan and Germany. This happened because the war and sanctions changed global trade, forcing Russia to replace the products and technologies it previously bought from Europe with things it now obtains from China. This outcome not only called into question the effectiveness of Western sanctions, but also exposed something more worrying: the arrogance of the United States in assuming that its influence remains omnipotent. What perhaps worked in the Cold War in a unipolar world where American power was unchallenged, now meets a completely different context. Today we live in a multipolar world where actors such as China, India, and Russia are challenging the traditional rules of the game. Ultimately, the war in Ukraine has not only been a human tragedy, but also a reminder that strategies based on economic brute force are no longer as effective as they once were. This political miscalculation is a reflection of how the power of the American empire is being eroded, not by a direct blow, but by the accumulation of strategic failures. Before continuing, if you find the content useful, remember to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Now let's continue. The decline of the empire is also reflected in how global conflicts affect the U.S. economy. A clear example is the scarcity of energy resources due to sanctions and blockades imposed on certain countries. Take the case of sanctions on Iran and Venezuela. These sanctions have affected oil production in those countries, which has reduced the global energy supply. This supply cut has not only raised oil prices, but it has also affected the costs of other oil-dependent products, such as food and manufactured goods. As the price of crude increases, transportation and production costs rise, which is directly reflected in consumer prices. In the United States, where inflation was already a problem before these increases, these price increases have only worsened the economic situation. Citizens face higher costs to fill up their gas tanks, buy food, and other essential products, which causes the quality of life to be eroded. This phenomenon affects not only consumers, but also businesses, which must deal with tighter profit margins. Companies have to deal with a more expensive supply chain, with rising prices for materials and energy. And while some large corporations can absorb these costs, small and medium-sized businesses, which rely on tighter margins, are forced to make difficult decisions, reduce product quality, lay off employees, or even close their doors. The impact goes beyond inflation, too. The expenses resulting from these global economic tensions are financed by debt. The United States has historically resorted to borrowing to maintain its economic and geopolitical power, but this model has become unsustainable. As interest on the debt increases, the country has fewer resources to invest in infrastructure or social programs that improve the living conditions of its population. Thus, what should be an investment in collective well-being is replaced by a short-term focus that only perpetuates inequality. Every conflict or economic sanction exposes the fragility of this model. And instead of tackling these problems at their roots, the government continues to rely on solutions that, in the end, only end up increasing economic suffering for the majority. The question we must ask here is this: if the United States of America is still supposedly an unbreakable empire, how is it possible that sanctions on smaller nations, such as Venezuela, can affect the American economy so much? Another of the clearest signs of decline is the growing gap in the distribution of wealth. While a few are getting richer, the working class continues to struggle to maintain its purchasing power, with wages that have not experienced a real increase in decades. This economic disparity translates into obvious social crises, such as the increase in poverty and the difficulty in accessing basic services such as health and education. The mental health and addiction crisis is one of the most alarming symptoms of this internal disconnect. Suicide rates, especially among young people and lower-class adults, have skyrocketed. In particular, the opioid crisis has spilled over the borders of the most vulnerable communities, affecting thousands of people across the country. This problem is not isolated. It is linked to a lack of opportunities and an economic system that has left many people behind. Meanwhile, large corporations continue to make profits without showing any real commitment to improving the living conditions of citizens. The public policy approach has failed to effectively address these problems, and instead of an investment in the well-being of the people, we have seen more incentives for large corporations and private interests. This creates an even greater disconnect between citizens and the system, and increases social fracture, something that any empire worth its salt cannot afford to continue for long. The social paralysis we are experiencing is not only a reflection of economic inequality, but also of the loss of internal cohesion. To better understand what the future might hold for the United States, it's helpful to look at Britain, an empire that once dominated much of the world, and reached its peak more than a century ago, but has been in clear and steady decline for decades. Today, the UK faces deep and complex challenges, reflected in growing social frustration. Over the past year, conflicts in the country have reached historic levels, especially in key sectors such as health and education. A clear example of this is the strikes by resident doctors in the British health system. These professionals, essential to the functioning of the National Health Service, have been fighting for years for higher salaries and better working conditions. The reasons behind these strikes are deeper than a simple disagreement over compensation. They speak of a health system that can no longer meet the needs of the population due to a lack of investment and an increasing, unsustainable workload. This social unrest is not only a reflection of the poor state of the health system, but also of an economy that can no longer guarantee its citizens the minimum necessary to live with dignity. Another example of Britain's decline in recent years is the crisis in London's public transport system. The city's famous transport network, once a model of efficiency and modernity, has fallen into noticeable disrepair due to underinvestment and budget cuts. Buses and trains are overcrowded, delays are more frequent, and the infrastructure is in a constant state of disrepair. Despite being one of the richest cities in the world, London faces an alarming lack of resources to keep its transport system running, reflecting a deterioration in the capabilities of government and public administration. The situation in the UK bears disturbing parallels to what is happening in the US. Although the US remains a military and economic power, it is increasingly clear that its ability to care for its own people is in decline. Rising inequality, lack of access to essential services such as healthcare, and poor working conditions are clear signs of a system that can no longer sustain itself. Public services like the British healthcare system are being dismantled or defunded. This pattern of internal decay and lack of investment in the well-being of the population is a clear warning for the future of the United States. If significant steps are not taken to correct course, we could see the country follow the same path of decline as Britain, turning from an unchallenged global power into an empire that can no longer provide for the needs of its own people. The decline of empires is never an immediate process, but rather an accumulation of ignored signals. Rising inequality and the decline of vital institutions are just some of the reflections of a system that can no longer maintain the stability it once provided. The future is not written, but history shows that inaction can lead to downfall. What is at stake is not just the well-being of a nation, but the kind of world future generations will live in. Do you think the United States will be able to reverse its decline before it is too late? Or are we facing an irreversible process? Leave us your answer in the comments. If you like today's content, remember to give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next videos. See you later.